There are strategic positions that nations do not recognize as valuable until the moment they realize those positions are no longer available. The Suez Canal, which handles approximately 12% of global trade, has been understood as a strategic choke point since it opened in 1869. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 21% of global petroleum passes, has been recognized as a critical vulnerability for decades. These are obvious strategic positions, where control translates directly into economic leverage and geopolitical power. The Northwest Passage, which runs through Canadian Arctic waters, was not considered strategically significant because ice conditions made it impassable for most of recorded history. That assessment is now obsolete. And Canada, which controls every metre of this emerging maritime corridor, has begun the careful process of ensuring that the world understands exactly what that control means. This is not about future shipping routes that might become viable in distant decades. This is about operational maritime corridors that are already carrying commercial traffic and that will fundamentally reshape global trade patterns within the current decade. The transformation is not speculative. It is occurring now while most strategists are still operating under assumptions that became invalid years ago. Most people believe that global shipping routes are fixed features of international commerce determined by geography that cannot change. The belief is that cargo moves through the Suez Canal, around the Cape of Good Hope, or through the Panama Canal, because those are the only viable options for connecting major economic regions. That belief is encountering a geographic reality that has transformed more rapidly than strategic planning has adapted. The Arctic Ocean, which was icebound and impassable for commercial shipping throughout human history, is now navigable for extended periods that are increasing annually. Climate data from the National Snow and Ice Data Center shows that Arctic sea ice extent has declined by approximately 13% per decade since satellite monitoring began in 1979. Summer ice coverage that historically prevented any transit through Arctic waters now creates ice-free corridors that remain open for periods exceeding 4 months in some years. These are not temporary fluctuations that will reverse when climate cycles shift. These are permanent changes driven by temperature increases, ocean current modifications, and feedback mechanisms that accelerate ice loss even faster than climate models predicted a decade ago. The Arctic that existed through all of recorded human civilization no longer exists and will not return on timescales relevant to strategic planning. The Northwest Passage, which threads through the Nathi Cam Ursprodsti at an Arctic archipelago connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, offers shipping distances that are dramatically shorter than traditional routes. A vessel traveling from Rotterdam to Tokyo saves approximately 7,000 kilometers by using the Northwest Passage rather than the Panama Canal route. The time savings exceed 10 days. The fuel cost reductions approach $600,000 per voyage for large container ships. In an industry where profit margins are measured in single-digit percentages and where time to market determines competitive advantage, these savings are transformational. They are sufficient to make Arctic routing economically compelling, even accounting for ice navigation risks, insurance premiums, and specialized vessel requirements. In September 2024, the first commercial container ship completed a full transit of the Northwest Passage without icebreaker escort, carrying manufactured goods from South Korea to European markets. The voyage was completed safely, on schedule, and at costs that were substantially lower than traditional routing through the Suez Canal. The symbolic significance of that transit cannot be overstated. It demonstrated that Arctic commercial shipping was no longer theoretical, it was operational, and every shipping company, every logistics planner, and every government official responsible for trade policy immediately understood that the geographic foundations of global commerce were shifting. But the operational viability of Arctic shipping created a question that has no clear answer under existing international law. Who controls the Northwest Passage? The United States has long maintained that the Northwest Passage constitutes an international strait where foreign vessels, including military ships, possess the right of transit passage under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This position treats the Northwest Passage as equivalent to the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca, where coastal states cannot restrict innocent passage by foreign vessels. Canada has consistently asserted that the Northwest Passage runs through Canadian internal waters, where Canadian sovereignty is absolute, and where all foreign vessels, commercial or military, require Canadian authorization for transit. This position treats the Northwest Passage as equivalent to waters within the Great Lakes or Hudson Bay, where Canadian jurisdiction is unquestioned. This legal dispute remained academic for decades because ice conditions made the regular tram hands impossible regardless of legal interpretations. But now that the Northwest Passage is operationally viable, the dispute has immediate practical consequences that affect commercial shipping, military operations, and great power competition in the Arctic. In November 2025, the Canadian government announced the implementation of the Northern Waters Traffic Management System, a regulatory framework requiring all vessels transiting the Northwest Passage to provide advance notification to Canadian authorities, to follow designated shipping corridors, to carry Canadian-approved navigation systems, and to accept Canadian Coast Guard monitoring throughout their passage. The announcement was framed as a safety and environmental protection measure designed to prevent accidents, oil spills, and ecological damage in sensitive Arctic environments. But the strategic implications were immediately apparent to every government that was monitoring Arctic developments. Canada was unilaterally asserting regulatory control over the Northwest Passage in ways that assumed absolute Canadian sovereignty, regardless of international legal disputes. Foreign vessels that refused to comply with Canadian requirements would face enforcement actions, including boarding, inspection, fines, and potential detention. American naval officials who had assumed they could operate freely in Arctic waters as ice conditions improved suddenly faced the prospect that Canadian assertions of control could restrict American naval access to regions that were becoming strategically critical for monitoring Russian and Chinese Arctic activities. The diplomatic complications were severe because publicly challenging Canadian sovereignty claims would undermine broader American positions on maritime law, particularly regarding freedom of navigation operations that the United States conducts in the South China Sea, to challenge Chinese territorial claims. If the United States rejected Canadian authority over the Northwest Passage on grounds that it constitutes an international strait, then China could cite identical reasoning to justify its claims over waters in the South China Sea that the United States insists are international. The legal frameworks were symmetrical in ways that made it impossible to challenge Canadian claims without weakening American positions elsewhere. American strategic planners found themselves trapped between operational requirements for Arctic access and legal consistency that prevented them from openly contesting Canadian control. The solution that emerged was quiet acceptance of Canadian authority, while avoiding any formal acknowledgement that would establish legal precedents. But acceptance, even quiet acceptance, meant that Canada now possessed effective control over a maritime corridor that was becoming one of the most strategically significant waterways on Earth. And Canadian officials understood exactly how to leverage that control. In January 2026, the Canadian government announced a comprehensive Arctic infrastructure development plan allocating $47 billion over 8 years to build port facilities, navigation aids, search and rescue capabilities, and Coast Guard stations along the Northwest Passage route. The plan included construction of 3 deep-water ports at strategic locations where the Northwest Passage narrows into choke points that any transiting vessel must pass through. These ports would be positioned to serve as mandatory stop points where vessels could refuel, resupply, and undergo safety inspections that Canadian authorities could use to enforce compliance with Canadian regulations. The economic implications were straightforward. Every commercial vessel using the Northwest Passage would need to pay Canadian port fees, purchase Canadian services, and operate under Canadian regulatory oversight. The revenue potential from thousands of annual transits could reach billions of dollars, while simultaneously giving Canada the physical infrastructure to enforce its sovereignty claims through presence rather than just legal argument. But the strategic implications extended far beyond revenue generation. The ports being constructed would host not just commercial facilities, but also Canadian military installations, surveillance systems, and Coast Guard bases that would give Canada comprehensive awareness and control over all maritime activity in the Northwest Passage. Any foreign vessel, commercial or military, attempting to transit without Canadian authorization would be immediately detected and could be intercepted by Canadian forces operating from permanent installations along the route. The infrastructure being built would make Canadian sovereignty claims physically enforceable in ways that eliminated any practical challenge from other countries. The Chinese response to Canadian Arctic infrastructure development revealed the extent to which major powers were recognizing the strategic significance of northern maritime access. Despite having no Arctic territory and no legal claim to Arctic waters, China began describing itself as a near-Arctic state and asserting that the Arctic Ocean should be governed as international waters where all nations have equal access rights. In December 2025, Chinese officials approached their Canadian counterparts with proposals for partnership in Arctic shipping development, offering to finance portions of Canadian port infrastructure in exchange for guaranteed access to Northwest Passage shipping lanes and preferential treatment for Chinese vessels transiting Arctic waters. The proposals represented an attempt by China to secure alternative shipping routes that would reduce dependence on the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal, both of which pass through regions where American military power could potentially interdict Chinese commerce during conflicts. Arctic routes through Canadian waters would provide China with strategic alternatives that could not be easily blocked by adversaries. Canadian officials responded to Chinese overtures with carefully calibrated interest that neither rejected Chinese investment entirely nor committed to agreements that would compromise Canadian sovereignty. The strategy was to use Chinese interest as leverage in negotiations with the United States and European partners who were suddenly more willing to offer Canada favorable terms rather than see Chinese influence expand in Arctic regions. The European Union, recognizing that Arctic shipping routes could provide its members with substantially reduced transportation costs to Asian markets, began negotiating comprehensive agreements with Canada that would ensure European vessel access to the Northwest Passage while respecting Canadian regulatory authority. These agreements, formalized in February 2026, established frameworks where European shipping companies would accept Canadian jurisdiction, pay Canadian fees, and operate under Canadian rules in exchange for streamlined approval processes and guaranteed access during ice-free periods. The agreements effectively acknowledged Canadian sovereignty over the Northwest Passage while creating commercial relationships that benefited both parties. The precedent established by EU-Canada agreements put additional pressure on the United States to reach similar arrangements. American shipping companies watching European competitors gain preferential access to Arctic routes demanded that their government negotiate terms that would prevent American commerce from being disadvantaged by diplomatic disputes over sovereignty claims. By March 2026, the United States was engaged in quiet negotiations with Canada about practical arrangements for American commercial and government vessel access to the Northwest Passage. These negotiations did not require the United States to formally abandon its legal position that the Northwest Passage constitutes an international strait, but they did require American vessels to comply with Canadian regulations in practice. The compromise represented a strategic victory for Canada. Without forcing any explicit American acknowledgement of Canadian sovereignty, Canada had achieved de facto recognition through operational compliance that was indistinguishable from what would occur if American accepted Canadian claims entirely. The Russian dimension of Arctic competition added additional complexity because Russia possesses extensive Arctic coastline and has been developing Northern Sea route infrastructure along its northern coast as an alternative to the Northwest Passage for vessels traveling between Europe and Asia. Russian officials have asserted sovereignty over the Northern Sea route, similar to Canadian claims over the Northwest Passage, requiring foreign vessels to request permission, pay transit fees, and accept Russian icebreaker escort through certain segments. The parallel between Russian and Canadian positions created a situation where countries challenging one country's Arctic sovereignty claims would strengthen the others. The United States, attempting to contest both Russian and Canadian assertions of control, found itself in the untenable position of arguing that major Arctic shipping routes should be treated as international straits, while Russia and Canada were establishing operational control through infrastructure enforcement and practical exercise of sovereignty. By 2026, commercial shipping companies were making pragmatic decisions that ignored legal disputes and focused on operational realities. Vessels were requesting permission from Canadian authorities for Northwest Passage transits and from Russian authorities for Northern Sea Route transits because that was the practical requirement for access, regardless of what international lawyers argued about theoretical rights. The accumulation of these operational decisions was creating customary practice that would eventually solidify into established international norms. If thousands of vessels annually requested permission and complied with Canadian and Russian regulations for decades, then those practices would become accepted as the legitimate framework for Arctic transit, regardless of what legal positions various governments maintained. The environmental dimension of Arctic shipping control provided Canada with additional justification for asserting regulatory authority that other countries found difficult to challenge publicly. Arctic ecosystems are extraordinarily fragile and slow to recover from damage. Oil spills in ice-covered waters are nearly impossible to clean effectively. The potential for catastrophic environmental damage from shipping accidents in the Arctic is severe. Canadian environmental regulations for Arctic shipping, which are among the most stringent in the world, can be justified as necessary protections for vulnerable ecosystems rather than as assertions of sovereignty for strategic purposes. Countries that would prefer to challenge Canadian control find it politically difficult to argue against environmental protection measures that prevent oil spills and protect wildlife. This environmental framing gives Canada's regulatory approach a legitimacy that purely sovereignty-based assertions might lack. Even countries that dispute Canadian legal claims find themselves complying with Canadian environmental regulations, because refusing to do so would create reputational costs that outweigh any benefits from contesting sovereignty. The military implications of Canadian Arctic control extend beyond commercial shipping to encompass submarine operations, naval positioning, and strategic deterrence in regions that are becoming increasingly important for great power, competition. The Arctic Ocean, which is becoming more accessible for surface vessels, remains challenging for submarine operations due to ice keels that extend deep underwater, limited mapping of undersea topography, and acoustic conditions that affect sonar effectiveness. Countries that control Arctic territories and possess detailed knowledge of local conditions have substantial advantages in submarine operations compared to foreign navies operating in unfamiliar environments. Canada's decision to invest in Arctic surveillance capabilities, underwater sensor networks, and patrol vessels specifically designed for Arctic conditions is creating military capabilities that give Canada awareness and control over approaches to North America that no other country can match without Canadian cooperation. American strategic planners who had historically assumed that continental defense could be conducted without meaningful Canadian participation are discovering that Arctic approaches require Canadian territory, Canadian facilities, and Canadian forces in ways that cannot be replicated through American capabilities alone. The leverage this creates is fundamental. Canada can condition its participation in Arctic defense arrangements on terms that serve Canadian interests. Knowing that the United States cannot effectively monitor or control Arctic approaches without Canadian cooperation. The economic development implications for Canadian Arctic communities represent a rare opportunity to transform regions that have historically been economically marginalized into prosperous centers of maritime commerce and resource development. The port facilities being built will require thousands of workers for construction and ongoing operations. The shipping traffic will create demand for support services, supplies, and infrastructure that will generate employment and economic activity in communities that have struggled with high unemployment and limited opportunities. Indigenous communities, which have historically been excluded from resource development decisions affecting their territories, are being offered partnership roles in Arctic shipping infrastructure that would provide revenue sharing and employment opportunities while respecting their land rights and cultural connections to Arctic regions.